Welcome to Standard Theory. In the previous segment, we introduced the view of traditional mental illness from the standpoint of the standard theory of psychology. In this segment, we will use the standpoint of standard theory to evaluate various psychological phenomena. We will discuss some topics that can be vulnerable to subjective interpretation when considering traditional views of psychology, including sex, money, gambling, and addiction. To begin with, the topic of sex as well as its associated behaviors and non-standard manifestations are directly objectifiable using standard theory. The aspects of the physiological phenomenon of sex do not necessarily need to be discussed in detail here. However, the associated activations and behaviors related to sex are closely correlatable to the patterns observed on the behavioral index and arguably directly relatable. In terms of sex from an intelligent viewpoint, the pattern of arousal follows the pattern of horizontal thinking. With some interpretation, the goal or endpoint of sex can be considered to be some sort of stimulation leading to an overload event that can be associated with a physiological response. According to the standard theory of psychology, this pattern of stimulation leading to overload is directly correlatable to the process described by horizontal thinking. In sex, though, the marking of the overload event is theoretically associated with either oxytocin or some sort of hormone as a result of that overload event. For that reason, the types of behaviors and communications related to sex during a physiological status which provides excess resources can be related to intelligent activation, and for that reason that type of sexual experience can be considered as intelligent sex. This is comparable to the interaction between physical arousal by way of exposure to androgens or pheromones from a partner and the subsequent buildup of that response to an overload event. This is parallel to the requirement of adequate self-interaction needed to experience the dynamic exchange of achieved activation. The phenomenon of sexuality is also related to the interaction between the type of androgen, male or female, related to physical activation in relation to the dynamic exchange of the partner, male or female, associated with the overload response. If a male individual, for example, experiences or associates both physical activation and dynamic overload with the exposure to a female and female androgens, that individual is considered straight in terms of their sexuality. When those circumstances of activation and overload change, the term regarding sexuality will change as well. The view of non-standard sexual practice such as fetish, kink or hang-up can also be described by the non-starred activation of the standard behavioral index. To continue, the question of the psychology of money can be easily objectified. In short, the handling of money psychologically is directly related to the measure of social intimacy. This is related to the abnormal activation of the seventh characteristic, or the social interaction. The use of money becomes related to a high or low energy process related to an item or idea. A way to further clarify the psychological aspect of money is to recognize intelligent use of money in terms of psychological activation. In one sense, the money can be thought to have an intrinsic value. This value relies on the interpretation of an individual in a way that correlates to intelligent orientation or intelligent understanding. The magnitude of an experience in relation to the overload associated with that intelligent understanding as well as the intelligent interpretation of that magnitude is objectively related to the perceived value of a process. This dynamic is related to intimate cycles of communication. This is the intrinsic value associated with an experience in an intimate sense. Another way to view the psychological importance of money is the social view, which is related to the price of something. The price of an item is objectively the same regardless of who experiences that item. Furthermore, the price of an item can be determined in a way that is related to how many of something there is in terms of how common or how long it takes to obtain. These factors do not necessarily require any sort of interpretation other than the awareness of those things within an environment. For that reason, the price of something is objectifiable based solely on the existence and availability of that thing. In terms of commerce, though, the way to obtain that thing based on its availability requires some indirect form of communication. That indirect process is handled by the exchange of money either as a trade for social construct or as a replacement for the dynamic related to intimate communication. In terms of social intimacy, the exchange of money at any rate which does not see the exact amount of price being exchanged for an exact amount of value will lead to some inconsistent interpretation of the social interaction related to that price. This can lead to the direct association of the dynamic of intimacy with some sort of social construct which, according to standard theory, is defined as social intimacy. Since most commerce has some margin of profit, an indirect measurement of money can be considered to be related to the amount of social intimacy experienced in relation to those exchanges. Gambling, though, while related to money, can be related to processes that are not directly related to money. The experience of gambling might involve money, but there is a chance that it might not. When considering gambling psychologically, the focus would be on the behavior associated with winning or losing while gambling. In short, the dynamic relates to the reward response associated with gambling, which can be parallel to the perceived removal of the inhibitory response or as a way to experience some situation which leads to an overload event. In gambling, this leads to some amount of either stress relief or reward response. Money, though, can be gained through these versions of social intimacy by those hosting the gambling. To address another topic, the view of addiction as well as its unique dynamic can be viewed using previously mentioned concepts within standard theory. As presented in a previous segment, the disproportional experience of an item or social orientation is considered to be related to addiction. This is identified by the reliance on or preference to communicate through social orientations, especially when used as a replacement for another type of communication. From there, the amount of reliance on that factor can be measured using the dynamic of cyclic thinking. In addiction, any type of communication including intelligence, emotion, impulse or compulse can be channeled through an item regardless of its importance to a third party. This sort of language of redirecting psychological activation to external factors can be considered its own phenomenon as an inverted type of communication, as it depends almost exclusively on the availability of an item rather than the physiological status of that individual. This sort of externalization leads to the understanding of the communication to be interpreted based on external factors as well as the possibilities associated with the third-party experiences of those factors rather than the interpretation of communication with any other individual directly. These types of topics and their associated problems have been addressed and interpreted by other versions of psychology in varying ways. Many of these interpretations have some amount of ambiguity and subjectivity associated with them. This can be considered true since each interpretation can be considered to take its own path. Please join me in the next segment where we will discuss these interpretations based on the standpoint of the standard theory of psychology.